Now that we have a way of displaying our services and grabbing them from the database, I want to take care of adding services dynamically. In the previous episode, we were adding them manually through SQL Pro or even through Tinker, but I really want to be able to do this through a form. And in doing so, I want us to talk about Laravel's validation system, which is very robust and you're going to use it all the time. Now, the first part of this episode is kind of a review, and then after that, we'll go ahead and tackle that form. In order for us to take care of this, let's create a dedicated controller for our services. It is something we don't have right now. If we visit the code right now and we go to our routes file, the web.php, you notice that we have this hello controller and it's going at services. So not exactly a dedicated controller. Let's do that right now. Back in my terminal, I will actually bump over to a new terminal in the exact same directory. That way, my PHP Artisan Csrf is already running in the background. Now let's go ahead and create a new controller. PHP Artisan make controller, and let's call it service controller. This will generate a controller for us and automatically namespace it and everything else. So now inside app, HTTP, controllers, we have this new service controller. As a first refactor, let's bring in whatever code is inside the services hello controller and bring it into this new dedicated service controller. So in my hello controller, I will actually cut out that entire services method that we had before, and let's go ahead and paste it in. At this point, this services name for this method is very redundant because we are inside a service controller and now we have this services method. Really doesn't make any sense, but in fact, this would be considered an index method in a RESTful controller. We'll dedicate an entire lesson to RESTful controllers, but for now, index is one of those verbs that we're going to start talking about more and more as we get into developing in a Laravel way using RESTful controllers. Now that we've brought this method into the service controller, the next step is to change our route file. We are no longer hitting a hello controller, we are hitting the service controller. And we're no longer in the services method, but we are in the index method. I'll hit save, I'll head back to Chrome, and if I hit refresh and you did everything correctly, nothing should change. This refactor was purely just to set us up into something better. Okay, back into my service controller. Remember, we are loading this services view. But it really, again, doesn't make a lot of sense for us to have a service controller with a view of services, because if we had another method in here, what would we call this? Would it be services 2 and then services 3? It's not great. Let's come up and establish a nice naming convention for our views. The way that I do it is I grab this right here, so service without the controller part, and I create a directory. Every view that this controller is going to use is going to sit inside that directory. And then I grab the method name. In this particular case, it is index, and I save that inside the service directory. It's a lot easier to see than it is to explain, so let's just jump right in and do that refactor. Inside my resources views, I'm going to create a new directory for service. Again, service is coming from the fact that this is the service controller. So if my controller was called customer controller, then the directory name would be customer. If the controller was called post controller, then it would be called post. All right, so we have this service, and now this services, I'm going to drag it into services. I'll move it, and then let's rename it. So we'll rename that to index.blade.php. Again, index is not like your typical index.php file. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the fact that this method is index. Picture this. If I am looking for the particular view being loaded inside the service controller index method, then all I need to do is go to my services directory and find an index.blade. If I had another method here called create, then I will go to my services directory and then to create.blade.php. That's the way this naming convention will work. This is not Laravel specific. This is something that I do that I find to be very easy and flowing. So instead of services, we're now going to load service.index. And again, if I hit refresh, we did everything correctly, nothing changes. Again, we're just refactoring into better, more maintainable code. Nothing to do with actually implementing anything new. We're just trying to establish some grounds on how applications should really be built in the real world. It would serve you no good for me to show you all these things for beginners and not show you a real workflow of how an application is actually built. Because when you go out to build your own applications, you don't know how to start. So this is very important. Naming conventions are important in Laravel. It's something we've already touched upon. And on top of that, keeping your application organized is extremely important. As it grows and grows and grows, if you don't have a concise, very meticulous method of organizing it, it's going to get out of hand and it's going to be difficult to maintain. That's what it's considered an unmaintainable code base. It's one of those that does not follow any particular rules in how they name things and how they store files. It's very important for you to have very organized applications. Okay, let's move on to the next step. Again, I want to have a form and I want to actually add. Now I could go ahead and add its own method, but why don't we just add it to this new index blade? We're going to have some services, but right before this, let's create a form. For now, the action will leave blank, and I'll have an input field here of type text, and let's give it a name of name, because this is going to be the name of my service. And then let's go ahead and have a button for add service. It's not going to look very pretty, but it'll get the job done. Again, I want to be able to fill this out and then add service. Now, if you notice here, when I click on this, it kind of gives me some suggestions. Now, typically on something like this, these are not repeatable fields. If you want to turn that off, you could say autocomplete equals off. And now, it will not give you any more suggestions. Just one of those small tips that will make your application a little bit better. So again, I will want to type in here and then click add services, hit something, and of course, I want that service to be reflected in my new list. Okay, now this form, it's going to be method of post. And then on top of that, what is the action going to be? Well, our action is a route, a URL, right? We need to hit a particular route. So what if we hit /service? Right now, we're using this services as plural, but I do want to start using service instead of services. So our route will be /service. So let's go ahead and create that. And I do need to create a little bit more space here. And let's create a new post route. It's going to be a post route again because my method is post. So it's not a get route, it's a post route. To create a post route, all I need to do is change this from get to post. And like I said, I want to switch from using services to using service, singular. So I'll go ahead and make that change as well. And then I will still hit my service controller, but this time let's use the store method. As the name would suggest, the store method stores a new record. Now, one thing with this change is now I need to actually generate my new links. Because if you remember in nav.blade, I'm still going to /services. So let me go ahead and go to single service. And let's go ahead and visit the right page here. And there we go. No big changes there. I could still type in here, hit add service. But this time I get an error, but we will start to work through those. Okay, great. So what do we need to tackle next? So we have this form and it's supposed to be hitting /services with post. But right now we know in my route, I am calling this store method, but the store method actually doesn't exist in my service controller. Let's go ahead and add it in. And then just to show you that it's quite not working just yet, I will actually just die and dump inside. Just a quick string here. If we are in fact hitting that store method, then we should see the text inside. Okay, let's give it a go and let's see what happens. I will type something in, hit add service, and we get this 419 page expired. Okay, this may be a little confusing at first. However, Laravel is helping us stay protected. This page expired is what's called Csrf Protection. And what it does is it stops anyone from submitting to our form that isn't from our actual application. It would basically be as if somebody made their own form but was redirecting the results of that form into our server. Most of the time, you don't want that to happen. Sometimes you do, but most of the time you don't. So the way that Laravel checks if this form is coming from your server or somebody else's server is using a Csrf token. Laravel makes this very simple. The only thing you need to remember in order to make this work is that inside every single form, you need to add this particular blade shortcut, and it is @CSRF. And I will actually just show you what that actually does. So what it does is it adds a hidden field in our form, and it is right here with a token. So this token is generated on your server whenever you refresh the page. Then Laravel is able to match up that token to your server token. And if everything's good to go, then of course this form is coming from us. Somebody who is actually creating this form outside of our application would not have access to this token generation process, and thus it would fail. So that's the way that that works. Now, if I hit add service, this time it does work. So as a quick recap on that, again, Csrf is a protection for cross-server, meaning that somebody in a different server can't submit to your application. Now, there are several reasons, a little bit outside of the scope of this particular lesson, on why you would want some protection against that. But again, trust Laravel in its opinions. Laravel is very opinionated, but it does it for a reason. You can always step out of the box once you are ready, but for now, let's stay in the box, and I promise you, it will all make sense. Okay, so let's keep going to the next step. Now we are, in fact, actually getting into the store method, and we know that because we saw the text of inside. And here it is. Great. So how do we grab this name? Remember, we are passing in a form that has an input with the name of name. Okay. So there is a helper function in Laravel, which is adequately called request. And to request, you can simply pass in a string with the request value that you are looking for. So I am looking for name. All right, let's go ahead and hit refresh. We'll say yes, go ahead and resubmit the form. And if you remember, DFG is actually what I typed inside this form. Let's create a new service here, maybe very cool service. And now when I hit add service, there we go. So we do have very cool service. So armed with this information, we are ready to make the very first implementation of this creation. And we can do it in the following manner. So we can say, okay, my service, and let's go ahead and new up a new app service model. I want to set the service name equal to request name. Remember, again, name is just the input. And then let's go ahead and save that to the database. But then after I'm done with this process, I need to actually redirect back to the same page. So I can simply return a redirect back. And there we go. So we're simply going to redirect back. Let's give this another go. I'll hit continue, and there we go. So we have very cool service. We'll type in some gibberish, add service, and there we go. When we type into this form, we know that it hits this service route as a post request. Notice that this and this are exactly the same. And that's nice because we can reuse names. We don't have to come up with these creative names. This is RESTful controllers. We'll keep talking more and more about this. But when it's a GET request, it will respond with the index method. And when it's a POST request, it's going to respond with the store method. Okay, then we hit this store method inside the service controller where we actually grab a brand new service model. We assign the name using the request name, and then we save it. And then we redirect back, meaning we're back into my index because that's where we came from. So that's working. We saw it working. However, something can happen. What if the user leaves it blank and hits add service? Whoops, we get this big error. That's because right now we are not validating this form at all. We are blindly creating and inserting into our database without any error checking. You should never, ever, ever trust your users whenever it comes to submitting forms. You need to be extremely diligent about what they send you, and you need to make sure that you sanitize and validate every single piece of data every single time. I can't stress that enough. Laravel makes it extremely easy to actually validate some data, and it uses that same request helper function that we already used. Let's create a new variable. We'll call it data, and then we'll say request. This time, we'll leave it empty, but then we'll say validate. And that is the key word right here. We're going to validate our request. Inside of this validate, you need to pass in an array. This array will contain a line for every single input field that you have. Whether they're input fields or text areas, whatever you have in your form. In our case, we just have one for name, and then you're going to match that up to some rules. Now, there are hundreds of rules that you can use, but in reality, you'll use the same 4 to 5 different rules. The most important one to know is required. Required will make sure that that input is not blank. That's exactly what we're looking for right now. So let's give that a go. I'll hit back. I'll go ahead and refresh the page. Actually, we don't even need this, and that should still work. And now I'll leave it blank and hit add service. And notice that this time nothing happens. But also notice that we are not giving the user any feedback at all. As a matter of fact, we don't know what happened. We don't know why it didn't work. Luckily for us, there's another blade syntax that will help us with that. And it is @error. So we can use it like so. We can say @error. And we can say, okay, if you have an error for name, then I want you to display the name. Now the name will come in as a variable of message. So let's just go ahead and type in message, and then let's end error. Okay, this might look like a little bit of weird syntax, but check this out. Now, when I hit request, the name field is required. We're actually giving our user some feedback. How cool is that? Laravel is actually smart enough to even generate a very nice sentence for us, telling us exactly what the requirement was that we did not meet. How awesome is that? It will really save you some time during development. So that's it. Just like that, we are doing validation. And on top of that, we are actually outputting out some errors. You can style these errors in any way, shape, or form that you would like. We can wrap this in a div tag. And just for now, let's go ahead and give this maybe a color of red. Typical for something like that. And sure enough, there we go. We have nice red validation error. Awesome. What if I had a new rule where a service needs to be at least 5 characters? So if I type 1, 2 and hit add service, it does add it, but I want to create a minimum character width of 5 characters. The nice thing with validation is that we can tag on as many validation rules as we want. It basically just creates a stack for us. To divide them, you're going to put a pipe, that's the big vertical character that is on top of your return key, and then we can add another rule. So we'll say, okay, minimum needs to be 5. Let's try that again. So now I'm going to type just a Q, hit add service, and there says, well, the name must be at least 5 characters. How awesome is that? Okay, what if I had another rule that maybe a service needs to have a maximum of 10 characters? I know it's kind of a crazy rule, but let's add another pipe and let's say max is going to be 10. Okay, so now let's go ahead and type a lot of characters, hit add service, and it says, well, the name may not be greater than 10 characters. How amazing is this validation? So just like that, very simple, you can stack on as many of these rules as you would like. I'll go ahead and delete the max rule because that one doesn't really apply. So how do we find all these validation rules? Well, in the documentation, of course. Let me show you. If we go to laravel.com, we go to the documentation, let's go into the basics and then go to validation. Validation is going to have available rules. It is right here, available validation rules. And these are all of the validation rules that we can use. For example, another common one you're going to use is email. You're going to validate that email addresses are in fact emails and not something else. Let's check out some of the other rules that we used. We used the required rule, and that one is right here. And it simply says the value cannot be null, the value is an empty string, or it's an empty array, or it's an uploaded file with no path. Very cool. So check out all of these rules here that you can use. There is a way of even generating your own custom rules, but that's more of an advanced topic. But with the rules available right out of the box, you should be able to validate 99% of all of your forms. Again, another great tool because it saves you time during development. There's even rules about dates. There's rules about JSON and size and same. That way you can make sure that 2 fields are the same as each other. There's literally tons and tons of rules. So definitely some homework is to explore some of these rules. Okay, so with that, we're adding services, we're actually generating. So if you stick with me just a couple of more minutes, let's clean up this controller just a little bit. This store method, it's quite heavy right now. So let's refactor into a little bit more manageable of a controller. Notice that I saved this to a data variable, and you may be wondering, why would you do that if you didn't actually use it? Let's do something. Let me die and dump that data. I want to show you what it actually gives us. I'll go ahead and enter some gibberish, add this service, and notice we get an array with name, and then we get that all together. Well, this is good. We can use that data, but it may not be very clear at first because of the way that we're actually creating this record. So let me show you a different way that you can create a brand new record in your database. You could do it using a static method call. So it would look something like this. We'll say app service : create. And to create, we can simply pass in data. Laravel's smart enough to map name, as in the column name in our database, to that. So as long as you've named your fields exactly the same way as your database, let's go back to the create services table. Remember that this is called name. If this was called maybe service title, in that case, my form field should also be called service title. Again, naming convention, very important in Laravel. Now with this is going to give us an error because Laravel actually has something called mass assignment protection. It is a little bit complicated in terms of what it does, but the effects are very easy to understand. It will not allow you to do something like this out of the box because you need to be explicit about which fields are actually mass assignable. And Laravel considers mass assigning a field if you are passing in an array of data with a bunch of fields inside of it. So let's go ahead and see that error, and then I'll show you how to fix it. I'll actually show you two ways how to fix it. I'll go ahead and hit refresh, which will just resubmit my form. And when I do, I see this new mass assignment error. Again, I want to show you the errors so that when you run into these problems, you know how to fix them. So it's actually telling us what to do. It says you need to add name to the fillable property. And this doesn't make any sense at all, but the one clue that we have here is that it is inside app service. If you recall, that is our model. Let's visit the model. The model is sitting right here, right on the app directory, and it's called service.php. We talked a little bit about this model, but we actually did not do anything with this file. So there is this fillable property that you can add to your service model. So we could say protected fillable, and fillable will equal an array. Now inside of this array, you're going to name each particular column that you want to be fillable. The one that we are interested in right now is the name. So let me go ahead and hit save and hit refresh. Again, there it is. And now it works. So again, if you have some forms, you need to be explicit about what is fillable. So what we've done in the process is actually clean up our controller. Notice our controller, how much cleaner it looks. Let me undo a couple of clicks here and let me show you the previous implementation. And here it is. So this is what we had before, but with this small change, we are now here. So a little bit cleaner. We can even inline this if you wanted to. This is an optional step. You don't have to take this, but you can actually inline this right here. And now we end up with this. Again, it's up to you which one you would rather take. I'll leave this one like so, but you can always inline straight into your create method. Very useful and very nice and easy to do. Okay, I told you I was going to show you a second way. If you don't want to have to put in every single field in here, instead, you can turn mass assignment protection off for this particular model. And the way that you would do that is, I will actually comment that line out. And now let's add another protected. And this one is called guarded. Guarded by default will guard every single field. However, if you set guarded to an empty array, that essentially turns off mass assignment protection. So that will actually turn it off for the entire model, not for the entire application, just for this particular model. And now let's try again and make sure that it still works. Hello again, add service, and there we go. So that is still working. Great. So that's it. Those are the two ways that you can fix mass assignment. One of them is a little bit more verbose, which is that you actually have to type in every single field that you had. Say you had a date field, and then you had another field. You'll have to keep coming back to this file and keep adding things to it. This is a very protective way of doing it. If you are not worried about that, then you can actually just turn that off altogether. So it's entirely up to you how you actually handle this. But again, just remember, mass assignment exception just has to do with Laravel protecting us from accidentally mass assigning a bunch of fields in your database and then creating a record in the database. So with that, we'll wrap it up for this lesson. Start to play around with adding some services in your application. And when you get comfortable with that, let's move on to the next episode.